Ian, the concept of process theology is a new way of looking, a modern way of looking at theology, but it's based upon a process philosophy. Can you help us through what is generally considered a very complicated subject?
Well, process philosophy derives mostly from Alfred North Whitehead, who was a philosopher at Harvard, had a great deal of influence on a number of theologians and philosophers. And he wants us to look at reality as a set of interdependent events, not substances, not little objects bumping into each other, but processes that are very dynamic, very interactive. He sees this in physics, where you don't have just particles, but you have fields and a very fluid and dynamic situation. And he also stresses that these processes can be organized at different levels, but particularly he stresses there is both order and novelty. Events are not all determined, whether you go down to the quantum uncertainties way back at the bottom of things, or whether you talk about the emergence of new things in history. So that it's a way of looking at reality that stresses temporality, becoming rather than being, events rather than substances, and then extends this to this more general analysis to include an understanding of God as related to this emergence of novelty and order.
So we begin with a philosophy,
Right.
as you've described it.
Yes.
And then, after we've developed the philosophy, then begin to look at God and theology with this new lens.
Right, exactly. And the understanding of God that comes out of this is a God who is more persuasive than coercive, that this isn't a God who intervenes to push things around. This is a God whose power is somewhat limited, and that, of course, runs a little bit against the tradition, but I think there are elements of it in the tradition. This is a God who pervades the world rather than intervening from outside. This makes the problem of evil a little more tractable, because you're saying even God doesn't have the power to intervene to dispel the evil. Even God doesn't know the future. If the future is really open, if events are really undetermined, then even God can't know the future. So it's a God of love, a God of persuasion, more than a God of power.
It sounds like it's a God who is like the senior partner with humanity in creating a future.
This is right. God never is the only cause of an event. It's always with the cooperation of the creatures, so that there's always an interactive element, even between God and the world. And God is affected by this. This is I think is a very interesting, it's a more ecological view, if you want, because of the interconnection of things. It's a view that stresses the limitation of God's power, or I would rather say reconceives power, not as power over, but as the empowerment from within. Whether it's, this is a kind of theme that feminist thought has picked up, that whether it's in social relations or in thinking of God's relation to the world, the sort of masculine male image of power as the ability to control is replaced by what we think of as maybe a more feminine image of God as empowerment and cooperation, rather than God the king, the sovereign, the monarch. So it's an interesting, I think, and I find it both makes the problem of evil more approachable, and it also ties in with some themes that one gets in recent biology and physics of this more ecological view.
I find it fascinating that in this view, God is more affected by the world. In traditional theology, God is so-called impassible. Nothing that happens has any effect on God.
Yeah.
God totally is changeless, and the world is totally distant. But I think you're saying in process theology that God is is affected. God has changed.
Yeah, and I think the God who is unaffected, who is unchanging, eternal, is a medieval concept more indebted to Greek thought than to biblical thought, because actually the biblical God is much more involved and is we're seeing changes portrayed, and I think this is an interesting and new kind of approach.
Some would say that kind of God is a weaker God, is an imperfect kind of God, because he doesn't know the future. He can be affected by these trivial creatures like you and I, and this is not the omnipotent, omniscient, great God of which there can be no greater.
Well, this is a God who is involved in the process and who perhaps suffers with the creation. And I think in the Christian tradition, the idea of the cross symbolizes a God who participates in the world's suffering, feels the world's hurts, and empowers it, gives it courage to persevere, but doesn't just immediately change the situation to dispel all suffering and evil. But I don't think there's any simple solution to the problem of evil. But if you say evil is unreal, then that's not going to hold. If you say God is omnipotent, then why is there evil in the world? If you say God is a God of love more than of power, perhaps, then you've got to be willing to talk about love as vulnerability to change and suffering even. So that it's not a human God, because this God is forever, and this God does have resources beyond any finite creature. But it is a God who is more enmeshed in the process and is more vulnerable.
Is this a God who created the world from nothing? Is it a God who sustains the world on a constant basis, as traditional theology would tell us?
Certainly it stresses the sustaining. God is a source of order and novelty and sustenance. Some process people do believe in an eternal world, but I think one's got to say this is a point we've got to turn to the scientists, because even Whitehead, for all his wisdom, lived before the Big Bang. Evidence was so strong, and I don't want to adopt a process set of beliefs. I want to adapt to whatever I learn from science. And if it turns out that there was a beginning, this is a little bit closer to the ex nihilo idea, the idea of creation out of nothing, and at least many interpretations of cosmological evidence suggest that the Big Bang was an absolute beginning. It may indeed have been the end of one cycle and the beginning of another, and Whitehead sometimes talks about cosmic epochs, so that even though one world has a finite beginning, the succession of worlds, perhaps, and I'm open to that possibility.
So process theology in that sense would be very compatible with modern theories of science and culture and human interaction.
I think so, and I think it has more to offer than the traditional, more substance-oriented view and more dualistic view, in particular because for Whitehead there isn't a mind and a body separate, or a soul and a body separate. They're more interpenetrating. There are more phases in every event, so that I think process thought avoids both a dualism of body and soul, or spirit and or mind and brain, or whatever dualism you want to introduce, without endorsing materialism, which drops out, if you want, the mental side of things. So I think it's a more inclusive view, and I find it a helpful one. But I'm open to what we can learn from science that may require revision at some point.